Oh, okay, now we'll get the shelf. There we go. Sorry, folks, for that opening shot. Here we are. There's the crew. Good morning. Welcome. It's a group today. It's all right. Maybe more folks will trickle in, but well, there's some colds and bugs going around, and people try.
And she said Roger was not there.
Yeah. Well, I want to, for the record, thank Darren for leading the group last week. How was the conversation on Saint Olaf, pirate turned king of Norway turned martyr?
It went great till he asked us. But there was some question we couldn't answer. It was at the end.
It was really neat about
A saint in our life or something.
who we found fine saintly, but not good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, Satan Center,
Yeah.
and we didn't have any things.
But in Darren's defense, I told him to ask you all that.
Well,
Oh, okay, good. That's a tough one. I mean, when you start digging into anybody, you might find some skeletons in their closet or some higher chapters in their life, but that's some like, I mean, think of Jefferson, right? Really amazing architect of the country and founding father, and then, oh, yeah, also the plantation and ocean that kids. We learn the whole thing, I mean, that's all right.
Well, George Washington, he was having enough neighbor, like, this fair, whatever.
Yeah, so no,
Fair
it's
tax.
very, only one person's perfect, right? As the saying goes, but you can still admire some things and recognize the faults too, so that's great. Today we move on to somebody else who has a little bit of a checkered past, not quite as illustrious as Olaf, raiding parties with the Vikings and things like that. But who got in some hot water with the church and came back, and we'll see how that goes. So today we're going to talk about Cyprian, Cyprian, who was a bishop of Carthage. Anybody ever heard of Cyprian? Okay. Just out of curiosity, had anybody ever heard of Olaf?
Yeah.
Or Saint Olaf?
I would say Olaf
Yeah.
College.
I didn't know that's who it was named after until I was
Well, it
reading.
makes sense.
Yeah. I also learned that Gustavus Adolphus College, which is also a Lutheran college in Minnesota, was named after the King of Sweden, who was around at the same time. So, the Lutherans who came over weren't super imaginative. Everything got named after something from the. Anyway, Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, was martyred in 258 CE. This was around the same time as, hold on, let me get my notes right. This was the same year that Lawrence, the deacon that we talked about a couple weeks ago, was martyred. And if you think about Perpetua and Felicity, who we talked about too, they were martyred in 202, but they were also in Carthage. So the year and the place both have other ones that we've talked about.
They burned at the stake because they were out in Mars, but not.
Lawrence was burned on a gridiron. Perpetua and Felicity were thrown in with the animals and such. So we'll get to Cyprian here, how he met his demise. But his story is a little different. Remember, Lawrence and Perpetua and Felicity were all very, I'd rather, don't let me live. I'd rather die and witness to the Lord. Cyprian's story is a little different. So we'll get into that. But it's that same city in northern Africa, Carthage. Here's the short version. Here's the inside of the book cover blurb. Cyprian served as a bishop during a time of great persecution of Christians. He insisted on receiving back those who had left the faith under duress. He also provided medical care during a severe pandemic, which was interesting. Yeah, exactly. That was my reaction to it. Ours wasn't the first one. All right. So here's the longer version. He was born around the year 200 AD to pagan parents. He was a prominent trial lawyer and a teacher of ethics. Our big history book, The Story of Christianity, Volume 1, The Early Church to the Dawn of Reformation, by Justo Gonzalez. We're on page 88. Just a little bit about his qualifications. Cyprian had become a Christian when he was about 40 years old, and shortly thereafter had been elected Bishop of Carthage. So didn't take like it's kind of like new members that right away, like, you want to get on the council? So 2 years in, he became a bishop. His favorite theologian was Tertullian, who you probably never heard of, but he's one of the kind of founding fathers of church theology. He referred to Tertullian as the master. Like Tertullian, he was trained in rhetoric, and he could easily overwhelm his opponents with his arguments. His writings are among the best Christian literature. I like that he overwhelmed his opponents with his arguments. It's kind of like Paul. In the year 246, he became a Christian, and in 248, he was elected bishop of the whole city. The next year, there was persecution under the Emperor Decius. And I can describe so that persecution, instead of just going after Christians or going after Jews and throwing them in with the lions or beheading them, like we saw with Perpetual Felicity and others, Decian's persecution was a little different. He was very much, you know what, Rome's having trouble right now. They were under attack from, some of the barbarians in the north that would eventually contribute to Rome's downfall. All these things were going wrong. So his response was, we're not being faithful to the gods, to the old ways. So he said, okay, you want to call yourself a Christian, whatever, but you still have to sacrifice to the gods, right? We're falling behind here, so everybody needs to offer sacrifices at the Roman temples. Well, of course, Christians and Jews said no. So that was what led them to get arrested and in trouble, was for refusing to make sacrifices. Things like that. So for Decius, as these arrests and executions started, his response was to go into hiding. So he went into hiding, and then he was censured for that. Afterwards, there was a big debate. After this particular wave of persecution ended, there was a debate. What do we do with the people who lapsed, who did make an offering at the Roman temple, who ran away and hid, like Cyprian, who was a bishop? Like, what do we do with these people? Do we just let them back in, or what do we do? So there was a guy named Novatus, who said just to receive them back with no probation at all, no questions asked, right? Let them all back in. Another guy named Novatian said, don't let them back at all. They're done. They're out. They're excommunicated. Cyprian, who was one of the ones under question, what do we do with these people? But also a bishop, also remember this gifted speaker and murder. He's kind of went with a middle road, and the Bishop of Rome also had this stance, so that worked for him too. He said, receive them back into full communion after a suitable interval of probation and penance. The worse their, straying was, the longer their penance, the longer their probation would be. So if you only just altered or sacrificed at the Roman altar, but then came back to the church, said I shouldn't have done that and came back right away, really short. If you're somebody like Cyprian who hid but stayed faithful, maybe medium. If you're somebody who went full bore, yes, I'm with the Romans now until it ended, and then said, oh shoot, and I got back. You'd have a one, right? So they had degrees. And so that middle road with the support of the Bishop of Rome as well, because remember, they weren't like the complete unified church yet. There was lots of different central cities. They went with the middle road. Now Novatius, the guy who said don't let them back at all, he broke with the church over this. He founded his own kind of dissident group that lasted for a number of generations. And the funny thing is, the guy who said let them all back in, no questions asked, ended up joining that group. So that was a persecution that he survived. He was not martyred as a part of this. You ever seen The Princess Bride? That movie, when Peter Falk's character, the grandpa, interrupts, he's like, I want you to know they didn't die at this time. It's like, wait, what are you talking about? You're getting really caught up in this. I want you to know everything's okay. They did. All right. Later, there was also a question of if the baptisms that were performed by priests or bishops who were later deemed heretical, they committed the heresy like this Novatius guy did. He said, okay, I'm leaving the church over this. Okay, now your group is out. Or somebody like Cyprian, well, what if he baptized somebody while he was in hiding, while he wasn't being faithful? So they were saying, do these baptisms count? Do their ordinations count? And there again, some folks wanted to take the hard line and say, no, they don't count. They got to get rebaptized. Funny enough, Cyprian favored rebaptism. Even though he got let back in after some probation, he wanted folks to say, no, your baptism didn't count, get rebaptized. Bishop Stephen of Rome at that time said, no, we don't need to rebaptize them. Now, Cyprian died before they settled that debate, but I will tell you, kind of like Paul Harvey, the rest of the story, how this ended. It came down to, if we say that their baptisms didn't count, then we're putting way too much stock in human actions. Baptism's got to be God's action. If we say it didn't count because this human was sinful, then none of them are going to count. It might not be the same degree of sin or unfaithfulness, but if we say that the priests and the bishops have to be perfect, none of them's going to count. And so, very Lutheran ahead of their time, all grace. So that's a little aside. Later on, okay, under Emperor Valerian, Carthage was suffering a severe plague epidemic. Cyprian organized a program of medical relief and nursing for the sick, and it was available to all residents, not just the Christians. However, not a lot of folks took advantage of it because the masses took the plague as a sign of the wrath of the gods at the spread of Christianity. The reason we're getting punished with this plague is because of all these Christians. We've got to get back to sacrificing to the Roman gods again. And thus followed another time of persecution. Excuse me. This time Cyprian did not flee. He was arrested, tried, and beheaded.
Okay.
Many of his writings have been preserved. He has an essay called On the Unity of the Catholic Church that stressed the importance of visible, concrete unity among Christians, that bishops have a responsibility to promote that kind of unity, whatever their differences, and he lived through some controversies and disagreements. We need to put forth unity because look at the world around us, they're out to get us. Okay. One other bit from here. Cyprian, who had become a bishop shortly before the persecution, first one, thought that his duty was to flee to a secure place with other leaders of the church and continue guiding the flock through an extensive correspondence. So in his mind, he wasn't being unfaithful by not letting himself be killed. It was more of like almost like an Underground Railroad kind of thing. Like he's going to hide, or like the Nazi resistance, hiding Jewish folks, or the resistance in France trying to work against it, right? So he thought, I'm going to go into hiding and coordinate things through these letters. As was to be expected, many interpreted this decision as an act of cowardice. The Church of Rome, for instance, had lost its bishop in the persecution, and the clergy of that city wrote to Cyprian questioning this decision. He insisted that he had fled for the good of his flock, and not out of cowardice. As a matter of fact, his valor and conviction were amply proven a few years later when he offered his life as a martyr. But meanwhile, his own authority was questioned, and there were many who claimed that the confessors of Carthage, these were the folks who never recanted their faith, who never gave in under torture to go sacrifice to the gods. They became known as confessors. They were seen as even more important than the bishops because they stayed true to their faith. And the bishops were like, oh, excuse us, we're in charge here. So there was also that tension. So the many claim that the confessors of Carthage, who had suffered for their faith, had more authority than he did, particularly when it came to the question of the restoration of lives. One last thing for a bonus. This isn't really about his persecution or martyrdom, but it's interesting. So Novatian was the guy that said, don't let these people back into the church. They sacrificed to the gods, they hid out, they didn't stand up for their faith, get rid of it. He clashed with the Bishop of Rome, Cornelius, because in his opinion, the lapsed were being readmitted too easily. Years later, there had been in the same city a similar conflict between Hippolytus, a noted theologian, and a bishop named Calixtus, because Calixtus was willing to forgive those guilty of fornication who repented, and Hippolytus insisted that this should not be done. At that time, the result was a schism, so that there were two bishops in Rome. In the case of Novatian's, I'm reading you the wrong paragraph, sorry. And it's still interesting. In the case of Novatian's protest, the result was the same. As in so many other cases, the issue was whether purity or forgiving love should be the characteristic note of the church. Or, purity. The schism of Hippolytus did not last long, but the Novatianist schism lasted several generations. Here's what I meant to read you. The significance of these episodes is that they show that the restoration of the lapse was one of the main concerns of the Western Church from a very early date. The question of what should be done about those baptized Christians who sinned divided the Western Church repeatedly. It was out of that concern that the entire penitential system developed. Much later, the Protestant Reformation was in large measure a protest against that system. So all the way back to the first couple hundred years of the church, what do we do with folks that were declared on the outs or who made a big sin like this? Do we let them back in? Okay, we'll let them back in, but they'll have to perform acts of penance, right? Have a probation time. Well, like any other good bureaucracy, over the centuries, that system of penance and absolution got bigger and more complicated and more ridiculous until the point where you got to Luther's time, where not only were they saying, go be a monk or a nun and pray for those in purgatory, or the whole concept of purgatory, where they were, selling indulgences to take time off your penance, where they had to do all these, Hail Marys and Our Fathers, or even like the really extreme cases when they'd be hitting themselves or punishing themselves. All of that started way back when, with things like Cyprian, who said, well, I'd like to get back in the church. How about we just have a little time out before I get allowed back in? And that grew and got more complicated and twisted and corrupted over the centuries until we finally get to Luther and others calling it. That was your bonus history.
Well, it hasn't changed a lot, has it? I think, we hear this sort of the same arguments, but when did? Come on, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was thinking, when did it happen that we started to talk about forgiveness with an absolute or that bad situation you got yourself into? With that after the Reformation?
I think there was always some strains of it. I think there were always those who pushed for that. But the more the church became an institution and an empire, the more they needed to have those systems and that strong control. But I think there were always voices who called for more leniency and more grace. But then you had things like the Inquisition. So you better get in line. I mean, still today, within our Constitution, as a Lutheran church, it's all about grace. We don't excommunicate people, but there is something in there that's basically censure, or that could remove somebody from that particular congregation's membership laws. Now, it doesn't say they're excommunicated out of the church, capital C, or out of God's love, but if somebody is persistently acting in a way that's contrary to the gospel, then there is a mechanism in our Constitution to say,
Right.
they can be removed from active membership. Now,
But if they wanted to come back to the service and receive communion, they could do that.
there'd be some conversations, but yeah, but no penance, no
Right.
public, they might be encouraged to issue an apology or change their ways. But that's a conversation, it's not.
Right.
Yeah. I know the Catholic Church still has confession. I'm not Catholic. I don't know what it's like today. But I know that there's still confession, and I know that there is value in that conversation where you're admitting sins. If it's not done in just sort of a mechanical way. Excuse me, that there can be value in that. We also in our hymnal have a thing for individual confession and forgiveness. It could be with a pastor, it could be with another Christian, it doesn't have to be a pastor. Because everybody has that ability to offer forgiveness in the name of Christ. That's one way we differ from the Catholic Church. We do the corporate confession and forgiveness at the beginning of the service, and everybody hears the words of forgiveness at the same time. But if something's really on your heart, you can always have that time of confession. But yeah, anything can get more corrupt. I think Lutherans, Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians, UCC, I think they're different from the common conception of Christianity. If you think about what the loudest Christian voices are in our country, it's gonna be the more fundamentalist ones that have like the radio stations, TV shows and things like that. Now, they're not asking you to do Hail Marys and Our Fathers, but they are asking you to get rebaptized or to do an altar call, right?
So my grandson got baptized. His mother was just convinced that you couldn't be an Episcopalian or Luther with that little old baptism we do, you know.
Yep, a lot of folks think that. That you were a baby, you didn't accept Jesus Christ into your heart. Then the Lutherans would say, oh, Jesus accepts us, it's not up to us what we do. In the end, it kind of works out the same, whether you have a baptism and confirmation later, or a dedication and then a baptism later. They accomplish some of the same things, but Lutherans would put way more emphasis, a lot less on them.
I don't remember the specific Sunday, but remember, I think Pastor Lou used to, on certain things, he had a big range.
Hole in a branch?
And he would go over the whole congregation and sprinkle water.
Yeah, that's a remembrance of baptism.
So is that on a certain Sunday or is it?
You could do that anytime. It's one of my favorite things to do is fling water at the time. Yeah. So there's a difference between getting completely rebaptized and kind of recommitting. And again, we could do that. We call it an affirmation of faith. It's not just what confirmation is. We could do that anytime. But then you can also just any day, Martin Luther said, you can remember your baptism every day. So we can do that in church with branch and water, or you can do it as you're washing your hands, draw a cross, whatever it is. But that's not the same as rebaptized. Now, we would say you don't need to get rebaptized. One and done. God's sacrament is effective, it's efficacious. It's a fancy word, right? You don't need to do it again. But if somebody did get rebaptized in some other church, it's not like that's going to kick them out of God's love either. That's background. Any questions or comments on Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, before I ask you?
Oh, let's see, when he was martyred, finally, he started out so young.
He was 58.
Of course, that was pretty long.
Fairly old for that time.
Christians decided to would be solutions to be all right.
How did Christians decide?
Yeah, I mean, if they,
Oh, later on.
you know, I mean, burning that state for heresy or.
Oh, like the Spanish Inquisition? When they decided that the purity of the faith, just like the Romans were doing back then, when they decided that at all costs the faith needed to be pure or we'd lose God's blessing or something like that. I mean, yeah, look at the Middle Ages. There's the Crusades, there's the Inquisition, there's wars. I mean, I've been, for my daily devotions, I've got this really nice, what you call it, composite, like it's a Lutheran history that came out after the 500th anniversary. And so it just has these short little 2, 3, 4 page episodes. It's each chapter is 1 century of Lutheranism. And it hits some of the theological, some of the hymn writing as the church spread. One of the ones that's coming up for me is that the small catechism is translated into all eloquent, in New York State Native Americans. So I've just been reading about these, and one of the passages I just finished is the 30 Years' War, which was different branches of Lutherans, Reformed, and Catholics all fighting each other, partly over religion, but also partly who was going to control that part of the Roman Empire, and just killing each other over which church they ascribed to. And so at some point, pretty early on, Christians started missing them. Our denomination has these things called social statements on various difficult social issues. Some of them are very kind of, we can see both sides of this, we maybe lean this way, but we're going to just talk this all, you talk it, all the different scriptural and different ways you could do it. Sometimes they're a little ambiguous, but they give you, they're not supposed to be doctrine, they're supposed to be conversation and study time. That's right, get people talking and praying about it. One of the ones that is very definitive is that, no, we're against the death penalty. It's like vengeance is God's, thou shalt not kill. It doesn't, you know, it's not helping bring lasting, reconciliation, which is, something we're taught to strive for in the New Testament. So that was one of the ones where they were very definitive. As Lutheran Christians were against it. Because I mean, Jesus was killed by the Roman equivalent of the electric chair, right? So
You probably didn't have that discussion of that time, but then today you have to add into it, you shall not commit abortion, right? And they didn't have that.
it wasn't this, I don't
Till
think it's in the
then.
Bible. We can get into it. That's a very good social statement. If we wanna do that sometime, if we wanna get into some social statements, I'd be game for that. That one's gonna be a little more, we're gonna pray before and after, we're gonna share the piece of the, we're gonna make sure but they're good teaching documents. We wanna broach. But I was part of a group presentation on the abortion social statement, in our ethics classes. And I know that one a little better than some of the others.
What is the Lutheran one? What is our social statement about?
It's just like, what does it come down on?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, just real quick,
No, I'm trying, I wanna make sure I'm saying it right.
cause you said death penalty was like absolute.
Yeah. So I think it says that. On the whole, it would be against abortion. With knowing that there are sometimes exceptions for the life of the mother, rape, incest, where it's. Maybe better. But it kind of steps back a little bit and talks about trying to make sure that. Whether somebody chooses to have an abortion or not, that they remain as welcome members of the congregation and they receive the support that they would need, having undergone a difficult decision. That maybe the church can help educate and support people so they're not finding themselves in that situation in the first place. That abortion shouldn't be used as just a form of birth control, like, oh, well, oopsie, but to try to like work on that, that's it. But the main thing it stresses in the end is that there's grace no matter what. Which, again, it's a little bit more nuanced than just saying we're against. I'm sure I'm leaving out parts of that. It's been a little while since. But they're all online. If you want to do those, we can. There's 12 or 15 social statements that are the big ones, and then some other, I forget what to call them, social messages that are more commentary, less tense.
It's been a long time since I've read it, but I remember what Lutherans are kind of, I don't want to call it issue, but you kind of leave it open on both sides. We don't, how many things we do not condemn one side or the other.
Yeah, that's true. I think they
Because
said that.
Lutherans still all believe, and I understood that California, sorry, you came to California, but California Lutherans are probably a lot more liberal than Virginia Lutherans. No, that's not true. That's
Where we serve
some seminaries are more
Sure, there might,
conservative and some are more
sure. It depends on, honestly, it depends on the congregation, the area, the professor. Where we were in California was ranch country. And on the southern half of the county, there was San Luis Obispo, which was kind of a surf and a beach town and with a big college, Cal Poly University. They were maybe a little more liberal. Our side of the county was all vineyards and venture capitalists and ranchers. Our side of the county was much more conservative. So we had the whole 9 yards. I mean, we had the whole spectrum. We had a pair of best friends who loved to tell everybody, hey, at our church, I'm a flaming liberal and I'm a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, and we sit next to each other, we worship at church, and we're best friends. That you didn't need to all believe the same way. So Minnesota in some ways was more conservative than where we were in California. And in some ways not.
We probably hear about the parts of California that are more liberal. That's probably what makes the news.
Oh, sure, yeah. But yeah, California is a huge city. LA and San Francisco might get more attention, but if you go out to Bakersfield, Fresno, some of the other eastern parts, if you go north of San Francisco into the more rugged terrain, the mountains, things like that. So it just depends. But yeah, it can come across as wishy-washy. But in a way, it's just trying to recognize the complexity of the situation
Yeah, okay.
and leave room for grace.
I'd rather have it that way than say, "Oh, it's gotta be this way."
Because as soon as you say it's gotta be this way,
Right,
then you start saying, oh yeah, but what about this?
or you really alienate a whole group of people.
Right, right. With the death penalty one, that one, I was kind of surprised that they were as definitive as they were. But yeah, most of the other ones are very, like I said, nuanced, take in the whole picture. Say, here's some things we do believe, here's some things that we are kind of afraid to debate about, that we know there's different sides. I am talking too much. This is what it is, you are, if you know, you tell me your story. So let's put that on the possibilities. Maybe we do a couple social statements here and there, work that into our rotation. It's not like you can really do one a week, like we could, but we'd be skipping over a lot. But we could do some of those. Maybe in the fall. Maybe over the summer, we could do some once a month kind of things. So that it could be a book study, but on social statements once a month. We'll think of it. Right. Back to Cyprian. Cyprian, who also had a sticky situation. Different sides. He tried to find a middle way and then contradicted himself later by saying, no, they need to get rebaptized, right? Nothing's cut and dry. Okay, so first off, I want you to tell some stories about forgiveness and redemption. These are, remember, I want you to practice telling faith stories because that's how we are going to share the faith most effectively, is by your own personal stories that relate to your faith. And keep in mind, forgiveness and grace are supposed to be hallmarks of Christianity, central to the gospel. So we should have some forgiveness and reconciliation stories. Could be your personal life, could be something that you read or biography or something in the news that really spoke to you. Could be a Christian thing, doesn't have to be, but maybe with this one it's a little more effective. But stories about forgiveness and redemption. We're forgiven.
Keep secrets.
Yeah, these could be very personal. These might be for when you've reached a deeper level. Let's see. All of you have been or are married. Any forgiveness stories from within a, doesn't have to be deep or painful, but any forgiveness stories in a relationship? And I two of you are across the table.
Say, I think forgiveness is a daily thing, and it's on both sides. You might come in and say, well, what have you done all that? No, it's little things.
Sure.
We don't agree 100% on everything. It just doesn't happen that way, and it's just like being here in the church. You decide that you can have different opinions and different beliefs about different things, but as long as the major thing is there, strong, in the middle of everything, you learn to get along with each other. Still.
And there's a little bit of that sort of, I don't want to say tolerance, but that choosing to interpret other people's actions in the best possible light, to say, you know what, that's not a big deal, I don't need to make a big deal out of it. But that's a little different to say, you know what, I forgive them, it's not a big deal. That's a little different than offering forgiveness to something that's truly hurt you. So that's good, I don't want to discount that.
Right. I think my ex-husband and I by the time he died, we had both reconciled that things were explained on both sides, and, there was no animosity there anymore, you know. We weren't buddy, but we were,
You know, civil.
yeah, yeah. We could show up at family affairs and get along.
Being raised Catholic and going to confession, would go to confession, and then depending on what you confessed, you were told to pray so many Lord's prayers or Hail Mary. And then, yeah, I felt like when I prayed that, I was forgiven.
Did you feel something?
Yeah,
that-
I feel freaking good.
Okay. And I think that's important to hear, because when you watch on TV, when you see, you know, the confessional booth, a lot of times it's used as a punchline or as, you know, going through the motions. It's good to hear that this ritual, that this practice had an effect for you,
Yeah,
that you did feel that.
and now I miss it, you know,
Sure.
everything is forgiven, and I didn't do anything.
Well, like I said, there's a thing in the hymnal, if you ever wanna get something off your chest, just give me a call, give Donna a call, you know, it doesn't have to be a pastor. But if you'd like it to be, I mean, we can still do it, you know.
Yes, your sin is supposed to be erased, right?
Hmm.
We used to teach kids in Sunday school, or not Sunday school, I think it was, that when, before Christ came, if this was sin, you put, you were atoned and you put a sheet over it, and you lift up the sheet, and it'd still be there. But when after Christ came, after you've been forgiven of your sins, you pull the sheet of it, your sin gets magically disappears, when your sin was gone, and you never had to see it again. I always like that. Little comparison.
The nations, in fact, I mean, I was born at the very end of World War II, but, you know, I'm sure there was a lot of animosity towards certain European countries, so forth, and now, for the most part, countries move on and realize they need each other.
Yeah.
So, I don't know how families feel that directly lost people in the war.
I had an uncle who would never buy anything from Japan.
Sure.
But you know, my brother had money to buy a car, this is whatever it had been, American car.
Oh, yeah, my father would never buy American cars. The Vietnam vet, the people who, what were they called, who ran away during Vietnam, went to Canada, they were the, yeah.
Oh, conscience.
Draft-
Jack-
draft-
Jack-
draft-
yeah.
I think they were eventually forgiven and allowed to come back.
I think so, and some of the veterans who came back, people didn't forgive them for, even though they
Oh,
didn't do
yeah.
it. Like they weren't the ones sending themselves over.
Yeah, that was in the church in Charlottesville at St. Mark's. John had come straight from Vietnam to Charlottesville, was still in the military station in Charlottesville. And the vicar there, he wasn't the full pastor, he was a vicar, was very anti-war. And, he didn't realize that an awful lot of that congregation was connected in some way with the military or the government, and it wasn't, he, you know, I think,
Yeah, learning experience.
yeah, he was young and needed to realize that, you know, there were two sides to every story.
Well, that's like the social statements, it's easy to just say, or for or against. But when you actually start getting onto the human level and hearing people's stories and getting into the messiness and the complexity and the hurt, it gets complicated really fast. It's no less real. When you mentioned nations, I thought of South Africa. When apartheid ended, they started that council for, I forget the exact name, reconciliation and forgiveness to work through that stuff as a nation. Germany took down, you know, all the Nazi and Hitler statues, and they put up memorials to those who died in the Holocaust. Still to this day, yes, there's still neo-Nazis, but they do a lot of work over there to make sure folks don't forget. I don't know, I've read about it. Have you seen some of those monuments and memorials that are over there when you go back?
But I don't remember that.
So,
The United States, the Civil War, you know,
oh, sure, yeah.
of course, there's still people fighting that.
We drove out to Roanoke for a cheer competition a month and a half ago, and I saw quite a number of very large Confederate flags.
Oh, they're in Hanover County, you don't have to do it.
Oh, I know, we had them in San Luis Obispo County in Atascadero.
But I don't think they're not as anti-American or no, I think a lot of them are just.
Yeah, but it's what you mean by it and how it comes across.
Looks to others,
Yeah.
yeah.
You gotta be
And
conscious of
in
that.
Lexington, in the west part of the state, of course, no all Jacks had lived there. and
Right,
Robert and Wayne,
right.
They, had lots of Confederate flags, but I don't think the white people ever thought of them
Right.
as a bad sign of wanting to get rid of the black people.
It was just like
It
literally.
was part of their history.
Yeah,
And then all of a sudden, the black people decided.
well, I mean, how did it, maybe they didn't mean it that way, but put yourself in their shoes, how would that look? How would that make you feel?
So I think they've come to some kind of middle ground there.
I don't know.
She would still buy one on private property if they can't do it there, right? I don't know.
Yeah, First Amendment. Regulate it.
In my old neighborhood, there was a family that flew one their front yard, I think, until they died.
So there's also that. So there's reconciliation on personal levels, and folks are a little shy to talk about that. I understand. But if you have somebody that you have a deeper relationship with, then within that relationship of trust and mutual knowledge, you could pull out some of those more personal stories when you had to forgive, or when somebody forgave you and you messed up.
It probably goes on every day, you just.
Oh, sure.
You just don't think about it.
But if you were able to tell those stories and relate it to the forgiveness that we receive, then that could be really powerful. I mean, that, like I said, that's central to Christianity. It's forgiveness and grace. So if we're not in some ways exhibiting that, the people aren't getting the whole story. No wonder church numbers are dropping, right? If it all stays personal. And maybe you don't want to air all your dirty laundry in front of everybody, but there's got to be ways to talk about forgiveness in a genuine and personal, authentic way related to the forgiveness we receive. Doesn't mean that you forget. It doesn't mean there's no consequences. I always need to put that out there. Doesn't mean if someone's abusive to you, you should be like, you know what, it's fine. I forgive them. There's no consequence. Yeah, there's still consequences, but there also could be. Let me ask a different question. It's kind of like, is there a sin so big? Are there human sins bigger than God's forgiveness?
Not supposed to be, no.
That's supposed to be. Okay. Okay, are there human sins that people act as though they are bigger than God's forgiveness?
Some of these mass murderers who killed lots of people who totally innocent. I guess it's a good thing God forgives them because people have a hard time doing it.
Repentance is still required, still consequences. Is there a story you could tell? Thinking tattoos on the heart, that what we did too. All the folks that were written off by society as being beggars and worthless and all of that. Just, you see criminals. They have the face tattoos or whatever. But this priest and his interactions with them and the organizations he started, speaking to us, he would do, trying to show people you're children of God, loved and forgiven. They're more than just their sins. Do you have any stories about something that maybe was somebody who was maybe labeled as unredeemable?
I brought this up last week, but Jesse from Survivor.
Jessica,
He was like a delinquent in California and now he's
Yeah, last season.
yeah,
Oh, he was great.
yeah,
Yeah,
he was super smart and it's like completely turned his life around, but
yeah, he had a PhD or a master's.
yeah, yeah, he's from
But yeah, he reminded me a lot of you weren't here for that.
yeah,
But the book Tattoos on the Heart, there was a guy, a survivor, who almost got there. He should, if he would have made it to the end, he would have won.
he like messed up just a little bit,
Just
like a little bit too,
Little cocky.
yeah.
But he was in tears because he's like, I'm doing this for my family. I'm doing this for all the other kids who grew up like me, who look like me, who feel like they can't turn their lives around, that they're garbage, just to say, if you put your mind to it, you can do it. It was really moving. If you don't watch Survivor, it's a good show. It's got its cheesy moments, but it's a good show.
We'll talk to like anyone in AA,
Yeah,
like,
oh yeah,
that's-
yeah.
tons of those stories.
AA does Christianity better than Christianity sometimes. They don't use the language, they don't use the theology or any of that, but being honest about your shortcomings, going to seek reconciliation with those who
Maybe
you.
the higher power, which I think is it.
No, AA is much more. AA models forgiveness and reconciliation better than a lot of congregations do. So consequences, if you fall off, you lose your chip, you start over, but they'll get back in.
I think in AA too, you have that. You have that trust that this person you have opened yourself up to, or even if it's a group of people you open yourself up to, they are not gonna talk about it when you leave the room. And sorry to say, you couldn't say that about all churches and all groups, but
That's true.
So.
Yeah, any kind of human system like that, you get. Dispersed housing things. Some places more than others. Those parking lot conversations, right? That's how I've heard them called. You get out of church and then you go in the parking lot. And I also think about folks who have gone through a divorce. Sometimes I feel like they can't come back to church, or like only one could come back to the congregation. But even then, well, I don't want to come back. I know you've shared a little bit about that in other conversations.
I'm the only one I can think of. At the time we went through a divorce. I think it was an epidemic. A lot of couples about the same age, make it through so many years. I bet there's a certain year in there that I think supposedly, but I think I'm the only one who kept coming back, and I think that if that he didn't come back, but he did stay with us for 5 years, and then he ended up at the one out of Great Big Church. Out close to Cold Harbor School, that big church. That was a huge one, just before you go on the interstate. If you go left Cold Harbor and take a right, that Great Big Church. Christian, no, that's not Christian Center, that's.
Not a Lutheran church.
In fact, I'm not sure whether it's a denomination at all.
What's the year mark everyone got a divorce? I'm curious.
No, it's not.
You're like, I mean, I've heard this stuff, I'm just wondering for like cultural references.
Well, no, we've
Stuff
been
you're
there,
at
we've been there 20,
20, oh.
yeah, but a lot of them don't get before that, but.
I think there's a lot of people at 20 years too.
I think
Like,
part of it
it's-
is,
I hear people in their 60s who get, well, sure,
well, the kids get older, they move out, and you realize like, things have changed.
or men in their 40s, watch out, when your husband hits the 40s.
I'm in my 40s.
Yeah, well, watch out.
Until I get to my 40s.
No, it's not so much women, it's men who just don't want to admit they're getting older, so. they're finding out.
It was always the sedate, quiet one. I went through a wild period when we first got. Well, we hadn't first got married. We had a couple of kids then, but they were small. And he was working all the time. He was trying to get established, and he'd have to travel on the West Coast to go to school, and he'd be gone for 6 weeks at a time. I got involved in and this was pre-1964.
Okay.
And I got involved in a big organization. It was you know, civil rights organization that I was really involved in. And good gosh, I just went through a wild period, but it was Bob who had to forgive me, it wasn't me who had to forgive him. You know, my actions weren't perfect. And, and he did, but not only did I have to seek God's forgiveness for sure. And I still, like, how does God forgive you? But anyhow, it was my husband, I had to get the forgiveness from that God.
Well, I guess that leads to my last one. Prodigal son stories. Okay, so it's, and I wanna frame it that it's not that you're better than the person who strayed and came back, all right? That's not the point of the story of the prodigal son. Was that the dad or the brother were any better than right? It's the punchline, the moral of the story at the end of the prodigal son is the one who was lost is found, the one who had died is alive. So the rejoicing at the return part, do you have any prodigal son stories? Because Cyprian, for all his faults and flaws, after he was allowed to be a bishop again and come back into full communion and in the church, helped this city through an epidemic. Witness to the faith and was martyred, wrote things down that are still studied and talked about today that still influence the Christian faith. So, do you have any prodigal son stories, rejoicing at the return?
Pat has a brother who's literally the prodigal son who got in trouble. Convicted felon, did something stupid and came back and, it's like turned his life around, so it's kind of cool. Almost at our expense, now he's like the favorite coddled one, like now that he's back, or
Sure.
like.
So when we do the prodigal son parable, you guys will be sympathizing with the brother.
Yeah,
I've been here the whole time. Yeah.
Like the stories.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I always think when you said that, I was like, I always
Yeah.
reference that. We're the ones who like leave and like, you know, he's the one who lives in town, so you gotta keep him and his wife happy.
So when you're sharing that story with somebody, be honest, be like, this is so annoying, it's so, backwards.
But we're proud of him too.
Yeah, I'm proud of him too. But I know, when I think about, how God forgives us, when I think about all the nasty things we do to each other, hey, like, pretend you're talking to somebody who's not Christian, like, hey, I know you're not a big church person, maybe you don't believe in God, but when I think even just the, whether you call it sin or not, these nasty things that we do to each other, that if I'm not feeling some sense of forgiveness, how am I ever gonna turn around and forgive somebody else? Am I gonna welcome somebody else back if they, when they turn their life around? So that's how you can do those in natural, sincere ways. Tie your faith to these stories of your lives and share the gospel.
I've always felt sorry for the other brother too, the prodigal son. I mean, there he stayed there and worked and did all that stuff, and I'm sure
Now,
that didn't work.
he comes across a little line. He comes across as a little bit of a
But
yeah, he never.
Scary.
He never.
that one I don't feel sorry for.
Some folks look at the story of the prodigal son at the brother, and they, some scholars have said to ask for your inheritance like the younger son did ahead of time is basically saying, Dad, I wish you were dead. Good, I have my inheritance now. But the other son, at the same time, it's in there, gets the other half of the inheritance at the same time. He didn't put up a protest either, so he's not all sleepy clean in this either.
My mother and her sisters, was one son and 3 daughters, and when their father died, he left almost everything to the one son. Let me tell you, there was some hard feelings with those 3 daughters.
Yeah.
But that was, my grandpa was from the old school, well, you had husbands to take care of you. That didn't go over too well.
I was on the sideline of a soccer game once, and one of the other parents was saying, I won't get into all of it. She has a son who's older, who was very, very, very athletic, like just took to it naturally, was a coach, was, playing at every level and playing at a really high skill quality. And she's got a daughter who was on our kids team, who was, playing well, but maybe dropped off a little bit. She's like, yeah, we're going, as soon as the girls hit 12, they just can't compete with boys anymore, and. You know, it just is what it is, and yeah, they're really terrible. Now, let me tell you about my son, how great he is, how great he is. And my daughter, look at her over there. I'm like, are you really doing this like right here in front of me? Jeez.
Oh, they're like, it's probably ingrained in the family too.
It never felt that way. You know, like, oh, yeah, my son, he can't do anything bad. And it's like, hey, screw up, you know, get in the car. Like, jeez, it wasn't that bad, but it
Yeah.
kind of made me go.
But you're not supposed to, as a parent, like compare them, I mean, and people do that as soon as you have like kid number two, like, how are they different, like. You know, and you have to try it, I have a twin brother, so like very aware of like not being labeled
Yeah.
and.
Yeah.
Compare, and like that, I think that was kind of detrimental to my brother, 'cause I was the smart one, but you know, like. Emily's in advanced math doesn't mean he's any less,
Oh,
but
yeah.
like,
We have
it's
to do
our
that.
whole life.
Because we've got twins and each one has this very unique personality, and so we do a lot of work to be like, hey, just because this one's getting more attention. You're two different people.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that when they were babies in the stroller, one very much in pink, one very much in blue. On a regular basis, we'd have people come up and say, oh, are they identical? I know it's a boy and a girl, and they're like, are you sure? They look so much alike. No. they're not.
Question my favorite.
What is it?
Anatomically, what do you know, what I'm gonna say?
Yeah.
Thank you,
Well,
thank you. I can't say words.
Anyway. I think we gotta wrap it up. Thank you for this one. So this is a little different. It's the same time period, same part of the world as some others we had. Who did the kind of stories are told of their deaths kind of, you know, martyrdom. Especially Lawrence, like, here's the treasure of the church, emperor, like, you know, thumbing his nose at it. Here's somebody a little different who one point went and hid with reasons. At one point, you know, was out of the church and came back in. And then eventually was still martyred. So, you know, a little bit more on the gray in between the black and white that we sometimes get in these stories. Next week, I think I'm gonna pull out a more modern day person, someone who was martyred in the year 1980. And then I'm not exactly sure who we'll do for the last one on Palm Sunday yet. Yeah, 1980 is the year for the next one. So we'll jump from the early 200s to Olaf in the year 1000 to 1980.
Is it something for you?
Maybe. It's one from our hemisphere. We'll see. Thanks, everybody.
Who died?
Who-
Well,